In early October 1918, across this war-torn and shell-shattered hillside in northern France, more than 600 doughboys of the American Expeditionary Force, surrounded and outnumbered, fought for their lives. Over more than 5 days, they sustained relentless assaults by their German opponents who used machine guns, mortars and flamethrowers in a bid to eradicate the pocket that had formed in the Argonne Forest. By the time that fight was over, hundreds of men lay dead and wounded across this battlefield. In this video, using veteran testimony and the very latest technology to explore the battle like never before, we'll recount the incredible story of the men history remembers as the Lost Battalion. But just how did those men find themselves lost here? Let's take a look. By mid-1918, the Western Front, after an unprecedented period of movement which had seen the Germans make huge gains in their spring offensive, had once again stabilised. Now though, having lost many of their finest soldiers in a failed gamble to divide the British and French before the Americans arrived, they were once again on the back foot, but far from defeated. With more than 1 million men in France by July 1918, the Americans too were ready to do their bit. Under the command of General John "Black Jack" Pershing, the doughboys had faced a steep learning curve in their first battles, but had learned well, and so, when in September a new assault was planned in the heavily defended Argonne region, they were eager to play their part. The battlefield they were to assault was right here, just north of the infamous Verdun sector, covering a 19-mile stretch of the Western Front running from the Meuse River on the right to the formidable Argonne Forest on the left. The objective of the assault, which would ultimately become the largest battle in American history, was to drive through the hard-pressed enemy lines in this area, outflank their vaunted Hindenburg line to the west, and continue a strategy of sustained hammer blows up and down the Western Front, which would ultimately force the exhausted German army to capitulate. In order to achieve that, in this area, both French and American forces would be used. Their positions looked something like this. By mid-September, Pershing had 3 army corps in this part of the line. On the right, in the Meuse River Valley, were 3rd Corps. To their left, and tasked with assaulting the stronghold of Montfaucon, were the men of the 5th Corps, and on the left of the American line, on the flank of the French army, which included the African-American 92nd Division, Buffalo Soldiers who were under French command, were the men of General Walter Liggett's 1st Corps, consisting of the 35th, 28th and 77th Divisions. It's with this last unit that our focus will lie. So who were those men of the 77th? Well, they were a typically broad mix from all over the world. The 77th itself, known as the Liberty Division, had been formed from men mostly drawn from New York State once war had been declared. Despite being an American division, the unit itself boasted almost 50% foreign-born soldiers, and amongst the Liberty Boys, a staggering 42 different languages were spoken. Amongst those were these men, the soldiers of 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment, led by 34-year-old Major Charles Whittlesey. Born into a middle-class family in Florence, Wisconsin, Charles had excelled at school, earning a place at Harvard Law before starting his own law firm. The unassuming and highly conscientious man took leave from his work shortly after the outbreak of war and volunteered for the US Army, being commissioned into the 77th, ultimately rising to the rank of Major, commanding 1st Battalion, 308th. Under his command was 18-year-old Private Lowell Hollingshead, an Ohio native. He had enlisted at Fort Thomas, Kentucky on the 2nd of January 1918 and arrived in France as a member of H Company only a few weeks before going into action in the Argonne. So what about the task in the coming fight? Well, it was an extremely tough one. Let's take a look at the ground to understand why. The Argonne itself was a formidable defensive site. Not only was it heavily wooded and covered with undergrowth for mile after mile, but that ground had also, over the last 4 years, been steadily fortified by the occupying Germans of the 2nd Landwehr Division. They had used numerous ravines and gullies to site 3 major trench systems along prominent ridges, named for Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. Understanding just how difficult the Argonne was to traverse is not easy today, but with the use of LiDAR imagery, which removes the above-ground foliage, we can penetrate the forest and see what, even more than 100 years later, lies beneath. Here, by focusing in on this sector of the battlefield and using these key roads to align the modern satellite with the LiDAR shot, we can strip back the woodland and reveal an incredibly complex and widespread series of trenches, mine craters and even shell holes. Ever since 1915, this area had been bitterly contested by the French and Germans, and so trenches had sprung up here and formed an intricate web which had to be carried by any attacker to stand any chance of success. But what was the view like on the ground? By dropping into the battlefield, we see just how difficult this area was to traverse. Not only was the undulating terrain a major problem, but the densely packed and badly cratered ground meant that every single yard of forest would be an almost point-blank fight, with barbed wire strung between trees, hidden trenches running through the undergrowth, and concealed machine guns just like this one, which would open fire at only a few yards distance. In short, it was hell for an attacker. But attacked it had to be. And so on the 27th September 1918, all along this front, 10 American divisions with French infantry supporting each flank would begin their advance in the bloodiest battle in American history. Signalling the start of the Meuse-Argonne offensive was a 3-hour-long hurricane bombardment of such intensity that in just that short time period, more shells were fired by American gunners than in the entirety of the US Civil War. The battle, in all fairness, opened relatively well for the Doughboys, who in both the Aire and Meuse River valleys, and despite a horrifically bloody fight around the fortified hilltop of Montfaucon, made some good progress. The French attackers too, which included that of the 92nd Division on the left, also made some gains, but the real issue was, unsurprisingly, here in the Argonne. The terrain, let alone the enemy, meant that quite simply the pace of advance could not be maintained, and with the Germans retaining control of key ridges in the Argonne, they could also pour artillery fire into the flanks of the advancing Allies. Those ridges simply had to be taken if success was to be achieved. Day after day, with the 77th Division in the lead, the Doughboys battered their way forwards against a well-entrenched and determined enemy. Despite the difficulties, the fight simply had to go on if the offensive was not to stall, and in terrain where communication and maintaining contact with neighbouring units was problematic to say the least, much of the fighting descended into company and battalion-sized actions. By the 1st of October, the American line had reached about here, though with the French 9th Cuirassiers and the 307th Infantry Regiment meeting stubborn resistance, little progress could be made. In fact, when attacks continued at 7 AM on the 2nd, only one unit in this part of the line could make any real headway. It was something of a mixed force. And here's a quick point. The lost battalion wasn't actually a battalion, and in fact it wasn't even lost. But it makes for a catchy title, and the newspapers at home liked it at the time, so we'll keep it. It was right here that Major Whittlesey, along with 4 companies directly under his command, 2 more from the 2nd Battalion and a scattering of other troops, perhaps 650 men in total, had attacked, except they had met practically no resistance. They weren't aware at the time they had inadvertently stumbled across an undefended gap in the German line. Despite serious concerns about his flanks, with whom he had no contact, Whittlesey's orders were clear: push on and drive the enemy back. So that's exactly what he did. Yard by yard, and now under enemy fire from the front, his ad hoc force advanced through this area of the forest towards his assigned objective, the Binaville-La Viergette Road and the nearby Charlevaux Mill. By nightfall on the 2nd of October, his men were exactly on their objective, digging in and waiting to establish contact with their neighbouring units. A job well done, or so they thought. In fact, it would soon become clear that although they had reached their objective, no one else had, and Whittlesey's force was now alone, almost a mile behind enemy lines. If you've enjoyed this video so far, why not check out our First World War podcast, Not So Quiet on the Western Front, where each Friday, Dr. Spencer Jones and I delve deep into the untold stories and surprising truths of a conflict that shaped the course of the 20th century. You can find the link in the video description. So, back to the action. So how do we know exactly where they were? Well, again, we can turn to modern technology. This LiDAR image of the exact location today provides a fascinating and previously unseen understanding of the battlefield. Here we see the valley up which Major Whittlesey and his men moved on the 2nd, finding this exact gap in the still visible German trenches on the high ground above. Passing through unseen, they reached what is today a modern lake, dammed in recent years. the water of which came from this small stream flowing along the next west-east running valley. This remarkable view even shows us the remains of foxholes and shell craters in the valley floor. Historical accounts tell us that Whittlesey's force occupied this area between an unmade track and Binaville Road on the steeply sloping north side of the ravine. More ominously, as we look north slightly and focus above the road, the LiDAR picks up traces of something that today we know was present, but at the time the Americans did not. Overlooking their positions on the high ground are the remnants of German machine gun emplacements with strong fields of fire across the entire area. The route north was blocked and the storm clouds were gathering. As the 650 men in this area dug in, Whittlesey sent a number of runners carrying handwritten messages back in the direction they had come to try and ascertain the situation. Not one returned. The reason soon became clear. The Germans had counterattacked and had pushed back the 9th Cuirassiers and the American 307th on either flank, at the same time closing the gap which his force had used to reach their objective. Worse still, the front lines were now almost 1 mile to their south, and all German eyes turned on the surrounded force. Realising they were cut off and already low on water, food and ammunition, Whittlesey dispatched the bulk of E Company to attempt to break through back along the valley to re-establish contact with the rest of his regiment. Lieutenant James Leake was amongst them.
On the morning of October 3rd, just before daylight, my company was ordered back to the position where on the preceding day we had assaulted and driven the Germans from their trenches. As we started back, we were attacked by a machine gun on the hill on our right. This machine gun was silenced and the crew taken prisoner. Then we proceeded on toward our objective, and just before we reached it, we were fired upon from each flank and from the front.
Of the 58 men in E Company, only 18 returned to Whittlesey to share the news he had for some time been suspecting. They were surrounded. It was now that things changed. No longer was this an offensive action, but a defensive one, in which the men trapped in what became known as the pocket would fight for their lives. Thankfully, as yet, the Germans had made no concerted attack, though mortar and machine gun fire was taking its toll. It allowed just enough time for Whittlesey to sketch out a rough defensive hollow square between the Binaville Road and the unmade track on the valley floor, using the slopes of the hill to offer at least a little protection. The real danger lay to the rear, where only a scattering of men and 2 light machine guns held the line. Each man now dug the best defensive position he could, working by hand to create a foxhole to offer at least some cover. It was just in time. Throughout the morning, German forces had been converging on the ravine with machine guns, mortars and riflemen in all directions, clearly preparing for an attack. When it came, it was from all sides, with a bombardment of grenades and mortars followed by infantry assault. Under a withering fire, the defenders managed to fight the attack to a standstill, eventually driving the Germans back to their positions, but at heavy cost to both sides. At 5 PM, yet another hail of grenades from the top of the hill signalled a further assault. This one, a firefight lasting 45 minutes, was also repulsed, but again took its toll, and the cries of wounded men, unable to be evacuated, would become an ever-present feature in the ravine over the coming days. Seeing the clear possibility of disaster on the horizon, Captain Haldeman attempted another breakout toward the American lines, but this too failed, and the dejected survivors could only return to their foxholes and wait for night to descend across the battlefield. Throughout the 3rd, Whittlesey had released his unit's carrier pigeons to try and get a message back to headquarters asking for reinforcement and artillery support, but when eventually it did arrive, shortly before 3 PM on the 4th, it did so in a horrific manner. In an episode that is still debated today, somehow inaccurate coordinates were provided, and instead, that barrage of high explosive and shrapnel shells slammed not into the enemy, but into Whittlesey's own men, causing as many as 110 casualties, including 30 dead. In desperation, Whittlesey released his final carrier pigeon, named Cher Ami, with the famous message, "We're along the road parallel to 276.4, our own artillery is dropping directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Despite being wounded at the point of release, Cher Ami made it to headquarters and the guns were stopped, but only to be replaced by yet another German assault. This time it was repulsed at the point of the bayonet, with hand-to-hand fighting breaking out all across the ravine. In a short but bloody fight, the Americans managed to hold on once more, though it had been incredibly close and part of the E Company line had been overrun, with a wounded Lieutenant Leake amongst those taken prisoner. Despite holding the enemy at bay, the American casualties were mounting by the minute. Ammunition was running perilously low, and both medical supplies and food were by now completely exhausted. One thing that was available was water, though at great risk. The small stream running through the ravine provided a vital lifeline for the defenders, especially the wounded, but it meant running a gauntlet of heavy fire from the high ground above in order to reach it. Many men fell in the attempt. By the following morning, 5th of October, the situation was desperate. Having lost upwards of 40% of his total force by now, the survivors were simply too exhausted to even bury their dead, many of whom had been hit again by the artillery bombardment the day before, leaving the entire area scattered with the body parts of fallen friends. The wounded too were suffering badly, with infection inevitably beginning to set in. Throughout that day, yet more fire was poured into the pocket and further German attacks held off, often with bullets and grenades taken from the bodies of the fallen of both sides. There was though a glimmer of hope for the men in the pocket, as a de Havilland DH-4 scout aircraft was seen flying slowly over Whittlesea's position during the day in an attempt to locate the isolated force. But as this view shows, locating dug-in men in this terrain was extremely difficult and no positive identification was made. One more hellish night passed which claimed yet more lives, but when the sun rose on the 6th of October, the 250 or so unwounded survivors of more than 650 that had entered the ravine had yet more to endure. Further attacks throughout the day, including one using liquid fire, were stubbornly resisted. The almost unbelievable fortitude of the men in the pocket was perhaps bolstered that day by the sounds of fire growing closer as other American troops made renewed attempts to smash through the German line and reach their comrades. Increasingly desperate to support their stranded men, a novel new approach was authorized by senior American commanders, which saw pilots of the 50th Aero Squadron bravely overfly the area at low level to drop supplies into the pocket. Despite incredible courage and the loss of several aircraft, the attempts failed, with the closest container dropping just outside the American perimeter. By 10 AM on the 7th of June, the utterly desperate men still living in the ravine steeled themselves for yet another day. For some though, the temptation of supplies was too strong, and 9 H Company men, including Lowell Hollingshead, at around 10 AM made for the nearest container just a few hundred yards away. As they approached, a spray of machine gun fire hammered into the group, killing 5 and wounding the other 4, including Hollingshead, who was taken prisoner. Brought in front of a German officer, Lieutenant Heinrich Fritz Prinz, who to Holly's surprise spoke faultless English and had in fact lived for many years before the war in Seattle, Washington, he was asked and agreed to return to the pocket and give this powerful message to Major Whittlesey.
Sir, the bearer of this present, Private Lowell R. Hollingshead, had been taken prisoner by us. He refused to give the German intelligence officer any answers to his questions and is quite an honorable fellow, doing the honor to his fatherland in the strictest sense of the word. He has been charged against his will, believing that he is doing the wrong to his country to carry forward this present letter to the officer in charge of the battalion of the 77th Division, with the purpose to recommend this commander to surrender with his forces, as it would be quite useless to resist any more in view of the present conditions. The suffering of your wounded can be heard over here in the German lines, and we appeal to your humane sentiment to stop. A white flag shown by one of your men will tell us that you agree to these conditions. Please treat Private Lowell R. Hollingshead as an honorable man. He's quite a soldier. We envy you, the German commanding officer.
Contrary to popular belief, Whittlesea's response was not "go to hell," but simply to refuse to reply and instead order his men to prepare to defend yet another attack. It came an hour later at 5 PM. Each man present knew it was all or nothing. Loading the last few rounds into their rifles and fixing bayonets, they endured another storm of grenades and jets of flame as the Germans assaulted from all sides at once. In a fight lasting 90 minutes, incredibly, the Americans once more prevailed and the equally exhausted Germans withdrew once again to their hilltops. It would be the last of the attacks on the lost battalion. By now, both the 307th and the remnants of the 308th Infantry were pressing in on the German cordon, and on either flank outside the Argonne Forest, French and American troops had turned inwards, threatening to cut off the besiegers. With time clearly up and the American pockets still holding, they slipped northwards during the night of the 7th of October, leaving the exhausted men of the lost battalion to count their losses. It was a long list. Of more than 650 men who had entered the ravine on the 2nd of October 1918, only 194 were on their feet when they left, with the survivors standing proudly for this iconic photograph a short time later. Close to 200 men would not make it home, either being killed outright or dying of wounds sustained during those awful days under siege. Many of whom, originally buried at the location where they fell and captured in this powerful photograph, today lie in the stunning Argonne American Cemetery alongside 14,000 fallen doughboys of the Great War. For those who did go home, when hostilities finally came to an end a little over a month later, there was instant acclaim. Lowell Hollingshead, the prisoner who delivered the surrender message to Whittlesey, eventually returned to Mount Sterling, Ohio, where he married and became a prison guard, often lecturing to local groups about his time with the Lost Battalion. In the post-war years, Holly even managed to make contact with Lieutenant Prince, his former enemy who had been so impressed with his conduct. The two stayed in touch until the start of the Second World War, where Prince's fate was lost to the pages of history. 44 years after the actions in the pocket, Lowell Hollingshead had a chance to return to France and pay his respects at the site where so many of his comrades fell. He died in his hometown in Ohio 4 years later, aged 66. Even those with a more unusual story found fame. Cher Ami, the pigeon that had brought out Whittlesey's last message, was treated by medics in the 77th Division for wounds to the breast and wing and the loss of a leg and an eye, but survived. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Palm and died on the 13th of June 1919 in New Jersey. After his death, he was stuffed and is today on display in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. For others, their post-war years were far more troubled. Major Whittlesey, one of 7 men to be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, may have physically left the Argonne, but his experiences never left him. Struggling to return to peacetime life and the demands that came with his celebrity status, he booked a passage to Havana, Cuba, aboard the steamship Toloa. On the 26th of November 1921, after an evening meal on board, he went on deck alone at 11:15 p.m. and was never seen again. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video interesting. If you enjoy First World War content, then why not check out our podcast, Not So Quiet on the Western Front, where each week we explore battles and topics that shaped that extraordinary conflict. And if you'd like to support what we do here on YouTube, why not consider joining our amazing Patreon community, whose support makes videos like this one possible. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.